Right, and we're working on Unit 3, Lesson 10, evaluating sources. So, like I said in my text earlier, this is something that's really in the wheelhouse of historians. It's what we have to do to write history, is evaluate source material. So our lesson today, we're going to be able to distinguish between primary and secondary sources and evaluate sources critically. So we're going to be learning, to question what we read and question the sources. So asking questions like, where did this come from? Is it credible? Is this reliable? Those are things that we want to deal with today. And let's see if I can actually get to the lesson. I have to, oh, there we go. That's why it's trying to log me out. Okay. The screen comes back here. I was just in there. I'm surprised that it's already timed me out. Come on. Oh, there it is. Okay. Maybe. All right. Now we're moving. Yeah. So evaluate sources critically and understand primary and secondary sources. So here's our audio.
When learning about social studies, you will often be required to analyze many different types of information sources. Primary sources are original accounts of events written by people who actually experienced them at the time, such as eyewitnesses. These sources may include speeches, documents, journal entries, and letters. Secondary sources interpret primary sources. Encyclopedias, newspaper articles, and history books are secondary sources. It is important to distinguish between primary and secondary sources to understand an author's purpose and point of view. Remember that all sources have a degree of bias or partiality. Be sure to evaluate sources critically. As with other areas of the GED test, questions about analyzing information sources will test your ability to interpret information at various depth of knowledge levels through the use of complex reading skills and thinking skills.
Yeah, so one of the things we want to do when we analyze a source is consider whether it's primary or secondary. There's even something as tertiary, but like it says here, primary source, the way you want to think about it, it's an original account. It is either a document or a person that was there. There's nothing in between it. So like the Declaration of Independence, something we've looked at several times, right? That is a primary source that tells us about the American Revolution, among many other sources, but that would be a primary source written by founding fathers. The Federalist Papers, something else we've talked about that dealt with sort of the expansion of the federal government and the U.S. Constitution over the Articles of Confederation. Primary sources that tells us about those developments, as well as the U.S. Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights. Those can be looked at as primary sources when we're talking about the development of the United States and our government system in a historical means. Also, journalists use primary sources. So like it says here, an eyewitness, somebody that was at an event and can relate that, is a primary source. Secondary sources are also good, but they basically rely on primary sources. So like it says here, history books, journal entry. Well, that's primary. So, government documents, speeches, journal entries and stuff like that would be primary sources. Your secondary sources, encyclopedias, I would actually consider a tertiary source because it's just a compilation of information. But it could also fall under secondary sources. Newspaper articles usually are secondary sources. They can serve as primary sources if there's nothing else available. So if you are looking at a news event, a historical news event, you can't find anything else on that subject, and that could serve as a primary source. But typically it's like a secondary source because they rely on eyewitnesses and things like that. History books are secondary sources. History textbooks, academic history. So, things like this, which is my the professor I work with, I study under, one of his books. And the thing about it, so when he writes, when we write as historians, anything that we reference, any documents that we reference in our works, any speeches, government documents, memos, letters, all of that, we have to cite it. And when you crack these books open, there'll always be a little number whenever something is cited at the end of a passage. There's a little number that'll be next to it, and that's going to indicate a footnote or an end note. And the end notes are just these huge pages of, like, almost a fourth of this book is just page after page of a citation referencing and noting where he got that document, what page it came from, all of that information. And the overwhelming majority in this type of work, like a history book, or certain, other, any type of academic writing, is largely going to be primary sources, because you want to see exactly where that stuff came from. You don't want to rely on secondary sources because they will tend to be biased. And even primary sources can be biased. And the back of the bibliography is just a list of every archive that he went to obtain all of this information. So that helps, that also for a secondary source helps make things credible when you can cite where you get all of your information from. That's really important. So we're going to talk about that a little more here as we go along. And let's take a look here what we have for our passage first. So about John Boehner. So on November 17th, 2010, his 61st birthday, John Boehner was elected by his colleagues to serve as Speaker Designate. And on January 5th, 2011, he swore in the 112th Congress as the 53rd Speaker of the House. John was reelected by the House on January 3rd, 2013, to serve a second term as Speaker for the 113th Congress. Under his leadership, the House majority has worked to make legislative process more open and ensure the priorities of the American people are reflected in the priorities of lawmakers. John led the drive for an aggressive set of reforms that require bills to be posted online at least 3 days before a vote, make it easier to cut spending, require legislation to cite its authority in the Constitution, and more. John also led House Republicans in adopting the first ban on earmarks, the secretive pork barrel spending he has opposed since his first days in Congress. Today, Speaker Boehner is focused on removing government barriers to private sector job creation and economic growth, cutting government spending, reforming Congress, and rebuilding the bonds of trust between the American people and their representatives in Washington. And I always talk about, looking at where that source comes from. Really, really important for this lesson. This is from speaker.gov, and it was accessed in 2013. It's also important to show when it was accessed because information on websites changed. So if we were to go there today, we're not going to find anything. Well, it will be archived, but as far as current, John Boehner is no longer, he's retired. Anybody know what state John Boehner came from? Nope. He was an Ohio representative. So he's from, I think, out towards, he was, his congressional district was out towards Dayton, I think, like the western side of the state. But yeah, he's an Ohioan. He served Ohio as Speaker, Nancy Pelosi Speaker now. So that's why, I mean, you have to be careful, if you go to access something, if you're citing something, you have to make sure that you show your reader that's like, well, things may have changed. This is when I got this information from this place. So our text box A, it says, if people are trying to promote something, they have a bias in favor of it. If people are against something, then they are biased against it. So we have to look for that bias. One way we do that is we look at how they discuss those events and the word choices they have. This all is coming towards, this idea that we've been working on here, right? With word choice and style, how people are writing and what they want us to think about it. So secondly, pointing to that at the end there, this section B says titles, labels, captions, and so on can provide clues about reliability and bias. Information from a website ending with .gov is usually reliable, but it may still express bias. And this is a perfect example. So .gov, right? That means that's the official website of whatever institution or legislative, branch of government you're looking at, right? Whitehouse.gov. Anything like that means it's the official account of that organization. Here, it was written by speaker.gov. So this is the website, the official website for the Speaker of the House. Now, like it says, it's reliable as far as the information goes, but consider some of the language there. Under his leadership, the House majority has worked to make the legislative process more open and to ensure the priorities of the American people are reflected in the priorities of lawmakers. John led the drive for an aggressive set of reforms that require bills to be posted online at least 3 days before a vote, make it easier to cut spending. John also led Republicans in adopting the first ban on earmarks, the secret pork barrel spending he has opposed since his first days in Congress. It's very subtle, right? This isn't like, John is the best Speaker of the House that has ever served. We're not getting stuff like that. But it's coming from speaker.gov. So who do you think wrote that? It was somebody in his staff, right? Yeah. So that's the type of things you have to look for. Same thing. If you go to whitehouse.gov right now, there's reliable information in there. There's going to be things that Joe Biden's administration are working on, bills they want to get passed and everything. But do you think it's going to sit there and slam Joe Biden? No, it's going to have a little bit of a bias that is promoting his administration. So that's where, even as a government website, you have to be careful. It's not going to, you hope it's not going to out and out lie to you. They're going to have to rely on information too. And there's going to be people that push back on that. So, but that's something you need to keep in your mind, right? That it's like, okay, well, all of that may be true, but it's also coming from his official website. So somebody likely in his administration wrote that. Have to keep that in mind. A little bit of bias worked into there, right? All right. So that is lesson part. Let's go over to the quiz, see what we get into here. Get some water. Okay, so our little bit on Mr. Boehner here again, and our test taking tips. So all sources have a degree of bias, just like we were talking about. Most scholarly works, secondary sources like the history books and everything, attempt to prove a historical thesis and have to acknowledge the bias in the primary sources they use. So this is what it's such a arduous process to write history, or even in any academic setting, because you have to account for the sources you use. You have to explain that they may or may not be right. So that's something to take into account. There's bad historians out there, and there's a lot of people that we call it cherry picking, where they'll take a piece of information, they take the best pieces of information, and they just sort of throw out any sources that sort of refute that, right? They'll say like, oh, well, look at this. This is, clear evidence that, the moon is made of cheese, or, whatever it is, the earth is flat, something crazy like that. And they just discount they just ignore anything that refutes that. So that's part of the bias, right? They're buying into the bias of the sources they're using. And as just human beings, we're biased. And it's hard, it's so hard to always remain objective. But as you know, in academic fields like history and journalism, things, you strive, that is your goal, is to try to remain as objective as you can. And it's very difficult, but even in the best situations, you have to account for that. So let's take a look here at our first question. Edda, you want to read question number 1 for us?
In which of the following ways does this excerpt show bias? A, the author is biased towards the position of Speaker of the House. B, the author is biased against Republicans. C, the author is biased towards Speaker Boehner.
Boehner.
Boehner. D, the author is biased against John Boehner's record. C.
Yeah, C. It's just generally biased. You know, it's not, like I said, it's not something that you know, makes you roll your eyes, but it's certainly painting him in a positive light. Just like if you went to speaker.gov right now, whatever they have on there about Nancy Pelosi, it's going to be positive, right? They're going to talk more about her achievements, the good things she's done. They're not going to talk about things, you know, that you know, negative things. So just, you know, that's what we're working with here, just trying to keep that in mind. And let's see here. So now we have an encyclopedic entry, right? So this is going to be considered a secondary source. It is, you know, it should be compiled of various primary sources. Let's see, Grace, could you read this entry for us?
All right. The federal judicial system originally comprised only trial courts of original jurisdiction and the Supreme Court. As the country grew in size and in the absence of intermediate appellate courts, the volume of cases awaiting review increased. The fidelity of Supreme Court precedents varied significantly among the lower courts. To remedy this problem, Congress passed the Circuit Court of Appeals Act 1891, which established 9 intermediate courts with final authority over appeals from federal district courts, except when the case in question was of exceptional public importance. The Judiciary Act of 1925, popularly known as the Judges' Bill, which was sponsored by the court itself, carried the reforms further, greatly limiting obligatory jurisdiction, which required the Supreme Court to review a case, and expanding the classes of cases that the court could accept at its own discretion through the issue of a writ of certiorari. Please, what word is that? Certiorari. Okay. Further changes the certiorari.
Best guess for me is certiorari. Let's keep going.
Okay. Further changes were enacted in 1988 when Congress passed legislation that required the Supreme Court to hear appeals of cases involving legislative reappointment and federal civil rights and antitrust laws. Currently, there are 12 geographic judicial circuits and a court of appeals for the federal circuit located in Washington, D.C. Roughly 98% of federal cases end with a decision by one of the lower appellate courts. From Britannica.com. Access 2013.
Certiorari. I'm gonna have to look that up. I don't know what that is either. That's a tough one. That's a tongue twister. Yeah, so that's, again, thanks for reading that, and the Britannica.com part, right? So we know where this information comes from. Probably should point out too, when we deal with websites, right? We all know that they have those different well, I don't even know what you call them, suffixes, right, at the dot. So .com is a commercial site. It probably the majority of websites, have a .com, but they are typically businesses. Of course, all our social media are .coms, things like that. .org is an organization. So, if you're looking at information online, that's something to consider. Organizations can be anything, for nonprofits, like our, CDC, Child Development Council, Franklin County, has a .org site. So does the NRA. So it's a very vast, right, spectrum that org covers. .gov that we talked about. So any official government site will have .gov connected to it. And then .edu is one you'll see a lot. So universities, for example, will have an edu. Ohio.edu is Ohio University's website that I've, spent countless hours on. So keep that in mind. So .com here means it's a commercial site. Britannica is a commercial, it's a commercial entity. It makes money. It probably has ads on its site and things like that. So we want to keep that in mind. So question 2, Sasha Gay, would you read question 2 for us?
Okay. In which of the following ways would you describe the information found in the source? A, the information is impartial. B, the information is dated. C, the information is impassioned. And D, the information is biased. Is it A?
Yeah, it's A. We can consider this largely impartial. So it's, and a lot of times encyclopedia is just a collection of information. It doesn't express an argument. Historical writing, there'll be an argument in there. They're trying to make a point. Same thing a lot of times with journalism, things like that. Encyclopedias, you have to be careful with, though, because also considered under that is Wikipedia, right? The online encyclopedia, which is written by users. So that could definitely be biased. But as a publication, things like World Book and Britannica, it's fairly reliable for just general information. It's trustworthy for that. If you just want to look up stuff about, like the American Revolution or something like that, something else. All right, so number 2 is A.
One question, please.
Sure.
What C means impatient?
Impassioned. So
Impassioned.
yeah, it's a good way to explain that. Excited about something. So it would have a lot of it would probably be biased if something was also impassioned, because if you're talking very energetically, like something that you enjoy, right? You get impassioned about it. You want to tell people about it. You're happy about it. That's kind of what impassioned is. Speaking energetically and excitedly about something. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And 3, yeah, we have the Britannica entry again. Christiana, would you like to read number 3 for us?
Okay. Number 3 says, to confirm the information found in the source, which of the following organizations' website would would likely be the best to use? A, the Washington Post. B, the History Channel. C, American Judge Association. And D, U.S. Supreme Court. Is it B?
So it's D. D is in dog. So here we're dealing with information about the Supreme Court and some of the lower courts. So if we wanted to verify that information, if we wanted to sort of fact check the Britannica site and look for information elsewhere, a good place to start would be the U.S. Supreme Court website. So it's probably like ussupremecourt.gov, whatever it may be. These other ones would also be secondary sources, right? So, the Washington Post is a newspaper. The History Channel, of course, they have a huge website with lots of historical information on it, but it's going to not necessarily have the information that we want, for one, and as a secondary source, it could offer bias. The American Judges Association may well have a lot of information about that, but also consider American Judges Association may also have some bias. So their best bet would be to go to the U.S. Supreme Court site for something like that. D as in dog. Okay, we just have a simple little graph here for number 4. So it's showing the population of Chicago, and it's a bar graph. We've seen before when we talked about charts and graphs. The y-axis running vertically is talking about populations in the millions, right? So in 1970, we have our years run horizontally across the x-axis down here, every decade, right? So 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000 to 2010. And what we see is a decline in population over that time. A little bit more, it started to grow a little bit between 1990 and 2000, and then it dropped again between 2000 and 2010. So maybe close to maybe about 3.25 million, maybe close to 3.5 million in 1970, and then well under 3 million by the time we get to 2010. So that's the information we're dealing with here. That's the other thing too. And of course, checking where our source came from, it's the U.S. Bureau of the Census. So if you want census information, if you want to know about population, that of course is your best source when it comes to anything to deal with the American population. So it's a reliable source, we know that. But you can have bias in charts. You can manipulate things to make it look different. So we got to take that into account. This, however, is certainly reliable, and it's very straightforward. We're just simply talking about population by decade. So question 4, Tracy, would you like to read question 4 and answer it for us?
Yes. What is the source of information represented in this graph? A, the city of Chicago. B, a federal government agency. C, an encyclopedia. D, a national magazine. B?
B, right? U.S. Bureau of the Census is a federal government agency. And of course, usually if you see anything like that, U.S. Office, U.S. State Department or something like that, right? That is federal. And of course, there's also, plenty of state organizations that would have information. I'm sure the state of Illinois probably has the population, census information, things like that about Chicago. But definitely U.S., that means federal. This is a federal government agency. B is in boy for number 4. And let's see, number 5. Fatia, would you like to read number 5?
Yes. Which of the following can be considered an example of a biased interpretation of this graph? A, the population of Chicago has declined over time. Chicago's population was higher in 1970 than it was in 2010. The decline in population was caused by an increase in violence by people with low incomes. The population of Chicago has been declining over several decades for many reasons. Can I see the chart, please?
Sure. Oh, there we go.
So, okay, can I see the options now?
Sure.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I think it's A.
So
Or either B too.
actually,
Yeah.
it's C.
See?
Okay.
So here I'll explain it. Right. So we have those numbers that we can rely on.
Mhm.
But what we don't have here is any indication of why the population
Okay.
declined.
Okay.
Right. So obviously D, it's occurred for several, it's declined over several decades, and there's certainly more than one reason for that. That's biased because it's thinking about, we know Chicago is a bit of a violent city. It's had issues with violence, but to state that that's why the population's declined is in error, because we don't know. Now, if you wanted to make that claim, you could say that hypothetically, right? You could say, has Chicago's population declined due to violence by people with low incomes? That is a huge research question that's going to take a while. And you could probably find, somewhere, I'm sure, that has done that research. And you would have to have, well, where's the population declining? Is it declining in upper income, upper class, neighborhoods? That might be an issue then. Is it declining in lower income neighborhoods? Maybe that's a reason. You would have to find, you would have to see, does that correspond? Does it correlate with rising crime? You're going to get into a lot of graphs. You're going to get into geography. You're going to get into all this stuff to make an argument for that. And you can't just look at something and say, well, that's because of crime, right? That's what we're talking about here. This is all about evaluating what we're looking at. So C for number 5, right? Cannot determine that's the cause without a heck of a lot more information. So that's indicating a bias. Number 5 is C. So what we have here for a quiz: 1 was C, 2 was A, 3 was D as in dog, 4 was B as in boy, and 5 was C for cat. Cat in my lap. So any questions on what we've done so far? Everybody have our answers for the quiz before we move on here? Good to go? Okay. So looking at the workbook for lesson 10. So analyzing information sources, you gain a better understanding of what you expect to learn from these sources. You can also determine the reliability of the information found in each source. All sources, like I said before, have a degree of bias, so evaluate each source critically. Think about what the bias is and why it's there. And then it says here, the ability to analyze information sources becomes particularly important when using online information. It is crucial to verify that online information comes from a trusted source. Typically, websites that end with .edu, .gov, or .org feature more reliable information than those that end with .com. A .gov is a government website. A .edu is a website from an educational institution such as a university, and .org is generally a website for a nonprofit organization. websites that end in .com are commercial websites that have the goal of selling or marketing. So, YouTube, for instance, there's a ton of informational things on YouTube. There's great, and I've posted stuff. Of course, we use YouTube for our channels. When we post our lessons, and then there's all kinds of other stuff. But as far as YouTube's ultimate goal is to make money. So they are not always going to be the most, they don't necessarily police all of the content on their website to make sure that it's reliable. This is something that's come up, that's really been an issue, the past, for a while now, but it's really come to a head over the last few years, as far as how much should social media be responsible for what information is out there. And it's really a double-edged sword for them, because if they, say, remove a certain president from their site for his misinformation, after several, warnings, they may be keeping misinformation from getting out there. But on the other side of it, you have a lot of critics are saying, well, that is, not giving somebody a platform for their free speech, which as a commercial entity, they don't have to do, right? Because they're a private business. So that's the thing to keep in mind with .coms. Inevitably, they're in it to make money. So as far as their fact checking everything with just vast, information that's out there, that's getting published every second of every day on those websites, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, it's impossible to constantly make sure that that information is reliable. So that's why .coms are a little bit questionable. If you look at something on .com, you have to kind of question it. It's like, is this reliable? Where did it come from outside of that social media site? How reliable is this? .orgs, again, you have to be careful. Even though they're nonprofit, they can be biased. But that's a decent place to get information. .gov, once again, that is going to be official information. So they're going to be leery of lying to you on a .gov site. It might be a little, they might sprinkle a little positivity on something, but they're not going to out and out lie to you. And .edu, those are universities, those are education websites and things like that. So there could be bias in there, but they're typically going to be reliable, especially if you're getting to things like archives and their libraries and things like that. Okay, so let's move on here. Okay, here's an example. So we have something from a .gov website and something from a .com website. So we're going to be able to compare these two. They're basically talking about the same situation, the same information, and we're going to see if there's a difference here. So from the .gov website, it says the Department of Homeland Security was established in 2002 in response to the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001. The goal of this information was to provide a unified anti-terrorism agency focused on raising awareness of terrorist threats in the nation, as well as preventing future terrorist attacks from occurring. And the text box up here in A says this information comes from a .gov website. As a result, it should be considered trustworthy. All right, and then from our .com website. So basically the same information. Let's see what it says. The Department of Homeland Security was formed on September 11th, 2001, after the terrorist attacks that happened on that day. The Department of Homeland Security was set up by George W. Bush. It is now involved in tracking down terrorists around the world. This agency has been very successful. And our text box B says information from a .com website, such as this generally tends to be less trustworthy than information from a .gov website. Be sure to support information from .com sources with identical information found in a more reliable source. So if you find something on a .com website, you want to be a little suspicious of it, be a little skeptical. Think about what you're looking at. Is this reliable information? And below here, it says making assumptions. So making assumptions, always use your best judgment when evaluating information. If the source appears to be unfairly biased, you should verify it with information from a more reputable source. Back up, I want you to be a little skeptical, not cynical, not suspicious of everything all the time, but question what you read. And if something sounds fishy, if it's not, doesn't really make sense, or this doesn't sound right, question it. Look for other information. There's plenty out there a lot of times, and then compare that and see, why this may be biased. What's the purpose here? Are they trying to, convince me of something? You go through those questions and you evaluate it. So number 1, Etta, could you read question 1 for us? Are you there, Etta? All right, I'm going to move on. Tracy, could you read number 1?
Yes, which of the following is directly disputed between the two excerpts? The date on which the Department of Homeland Security was created. B, the reason for the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. C, the responsibilities of the Department of Homeland Security. D, the creator of the Department of Homeland Security. The responsibility. C.
So it's A, and we'll go back and take a quick look. The Department of Homeland Security was established in 2002. That's what the .gov site says. The Department of Homeland Security on the .com website, the Department of Homeland Security was formed on September 11th, 2001. So that's the dispute, right? One saying it wasn't formed until 2002. The other on September 11th, 2001. Here's one, you could start being suspicious. So, we all know September 11th, 2001, that was the terrorist attacks on, New York, the Pentagon, and the flight that crashed in Pennsylvania. Did George W. Bush have time to form an entire new department under his cabinet the day of those attacks? That's where you have to start questioning things. I remember that day, and I remember what was going on pretty well, and I remember where George W. Bush was, trying to fly back to D.C. just to get back to Washington, D.C., because I think he was in Florida when he heard about the attacks. So, of course, you guys might not remember that. You might be too young, or it might just not stick out. But, that's one of those things that kind of stands out. It's like, on the day of the attacks, he formed a new department. That sounds a little suspicious. Of course, it doesn't come until 2002. Once the dust kind of settles on the attacks, and we have time to reevaluate our security and all that. That's when it actually took place. So yeah, there's a dispute there as far as the date. So A for number 1. Okay, and number 2, we have the same information. Let's see, Sasha Gay, could you read number 2 there for us?
It says, in comparison to that of the second excerpt, in which of the following ways could the tone of the first excerpt be described? A, scholarly, B, biased, C, informal, or D, emotional? Is it A?
Yeah, A, scholarly, right? It's Not very biased. It's pretty straightforward information. Doesn't really say a whole lot. It just says, what the goal was. So it says the goal of this organization was to provide a unified anti-terrorism agency focused on raising awareness of terrorist threats in the nation. It doesn't say it was successful, right? That might add a little bias. It was overwhelmingly successful at deterring another terrorist attack, something like that. That type of language would be biased. It's certainly formal, it's not informal. It's not like, hey, yo, this is George W. Bush's, new Homeland Security, right? It's very official sounding, emotional, not necessarily, right? Like we talked about, Fatia mentioned about impassioned. Is it emotional? Is it trying to invoke a certain response from you? It's just giving you information. So it's scholarly. All right. And we have, we're going to have a little, our drop down boxes for the next one here. We got some information in a table. So let's look at our table here. We have 3 columns. So we have type of federalism. So we're going to be, talking about that idea of sort of a larger federal government. The time period. So we have 4 entries here, going from 1789 up to 1981, or basically the present, right? It's 1981 dash, so it's talking about up to the present. And then characteristics under each. So the changing idea of federalism over time, or changing characteristics within the idea of federalism. So for starters, that first period there, dual federalism between 1789, right there around the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, right, to 1930. So that's quite a long time. So it says states and federal governments are separate, sovereign, equal. Federal government powers are limited to those listed in the Constitution. So not a lot of change between 1789 and 1930. Just this idea that states and federal governments are separate, sovereign, and equal. They share a fairly balanced idea of power. And federal government's rather limited, and there's a little bit stricter adherence, right? Remember that word? We talked about adherence, sticking to something. So it's adheres to the Constitution. And then the era of cooperative federalism. So that's from 1930 to 1960. So one thing right away, if we think about that time, 1929. Anybody remember what happened in 1929? From some of our other lessons. What started in 1929? It's going to be right here, right? The Great Depression. So that's changing the government. So it says the federal powers increased in order to deal with effects of the Great Depression. Federal and state governments share powers and cooperate. So we talked about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, right? The expansion of sort of executive, the executive branch, more federal powers, trying to boost the economy, get us back out of the Depression. So a lot of effort by the president in his office to do so. So federal powers increased at that time. It was more of a sharing of powers. State, I don't want to say state power eroded, but it had to share more with federal government. The federal government was more visible to all the citizens at that time. And then creative federalism, so 1960 to 1980. Now a different era. We're past World War II. We're in the Cold War, basically. And it says federal government bypasses states and gives special purpose grants directly to local governments. Grants can be used only for the designated purpose. Local governments and states bear costs of implementing grants. So further expansion, at this time, we're also in the civil rights era. So that also had some federal involvement, right? Expansion of federal powers. And in order to gain that we talked about this with the drinking age. So this is how this goes along with that. One way the federal government can influence state governments to do things is by withholding federal money. So that's what it's talking about here, is like if you want a grant for something specific, then you have to kind of go with what the federal government wants. So that's creative federalism there. And then new federalism, which was under the start in the Reagan years, 1981, federal government gives more open-ended block grants. Local and state governments have more choice about how grants are used, and power shifts to states for some programs. So some of that is due to having a more conservative administration in that time that's trying to shift the power back to the states to some degree. Okay, so that's our four sort of evolutions of federalism through the course of US history. So looking at our little drop-down boxes here, I'll go ahead and read through and you guys could jump in with the answers. So federalism has shaped the United States from its beginning as a nation. The face of federalism itself has changed over the years. The table, whose source was most likely A, where do you think this information would have come from? A journal entry, a newspaper editorial, a political speech, or a college history textbook?
D.
D. Yeah, this is definitely something I could see in a college textbook. When we're talking about having a chapter on federalism or something, political history, and boom, you'd have a graphic like that with information in it, a table like that for sure. So it illustrates how the relationship between the states and the federal government has ebbed and flowed over the years in an attempt to find a balance between state and federal governments. The information in the table is A, unreliable, impartial, biased, or propaganda.
Impartial.
Impartial, most likely, right? We could probably rely on this information that it lines up with those ideas. So impartial, based on its source. The table is most useful for discovering how the types of federalisms were named, B, characteristics of the different types of federalism, C, determining the president's views on federalism, or D, categorizing government rights.
B.
B, yeah, learning characteristics, right? We get the name and then we get some ideas, right? That's boom, right in there, characteristics. It's that whole third column. So then, although the table contains factual information about federalism and its history in the United States, one can interpret the information in different ways. For example, a statement such as dual federalism was the most effective as evidenced by its longevity is B, an impartial, C, a bitter, or D, an angry interpretation of the table.
A.
Hey, right? It's hard to say. You would have to have a lot more information to say that it, just that's very general. It is biased, but it's also just a generalization, right? Statements that federal governments are separate, so federal government powers are limited. There's this idea that it's more successful. Not enough information there, so that shows some bias. So our first answer there in the first drop-down box was college history textbooks. That was D. Second is B, impartial. The third is B, learning the characteristics of the different types of federalism. And A, biased interpretation of the table. Okay, so there we go. We'll submit that. All lights up green for us. Okay. And we have Fiscal Federalism by Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute. Let's see here. Grace, would you like to read? How about taking the first two paragraphs for us?
All right. Under the Constitution, the federal government was assigned specific limited powers, and most government functions were left to the states. To ensure that people understood the limits of federal power, The framers added the Constitution's 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the state respectively or to the people. The 10th Amendment embodies federalism, the idea that federal and state governments have separate areas of activity and that federal responsibilities were few and defined. As James Madison noted, historically, federalism acted as a safeguard of American freedoms. Indeed, President Ronald Reagan noted in a 1987 executive order, federalism is rooted in the knowledge that our political liberties are best assured by limiting the size and scope of the national government.
Okay. Tracy, would you like to read the next two?
Yes. Unfortunately, policymakers and courts have mainly discarded federalism in recent decades. Congress has undertaken many activities that were traditionally reserved to the state and the private sector. Grant in aid are a primary mechanism that the federal government has used to extend its power into state and local affairs. Grants as subsidy programs that are combined with federal regulatory controls to micromanage state and local activities. The federal government spends about $500 billion annually on aid to the state, making it the third largest item in the budget after Social Security and national defense. The number of different aid programs has shot from 463 in 1990 to 814 by 2006.
Christiana, you want to read the last paragraph?
Okay. With this large and complex array of aid activities, federal and state policymakers are mainly interested in the spending levels of program and regulatory compliances, not on delivering quality service, and by involving all levels of government in just about every policy activity. The aid system creates a lack of accountability. Congress should reconsider aid program and begin terminating activities that could be better performed by the state or the private sector. Shall I continue with the question? Okay, so which of the following best describes the ways this source of bias? A, this source is biased against accountability. B, this source is biased towards federal aid program. C, this source is biased against states' rights. D, this source is biased towards federalism. Is it D?
D, yeah, federalism. I'll tell you what, I wouldn't have to read any of that. All I'd have to do is look at the website and I could tell you it's biased. Okay, because it says downsizinggovernment.org, right? That's telling you already, if they want to downsize government, that they probably have a bias towards federalism, right? So we kind of know, just generally understanding that federalism means a strong central government. And I also know, because I've been around the block and I've seen a thing or two, the Cato Institute. So there's a lot of these public policy think tanks, and they, work on, like it says, public policy. They analyze things. I worked for the RAND Corporation for a couple summers, in their summer associate program. RAND has moved away from they don't want to be associated with the word think tank, because it has become synonymous with bias, with a particular point of view. So it could go either way. It could be a liberal, a more progressive one, or it could be a conservative one. So let me read you. Okay, so this is by Chris Edwards of the Cato Institute. From the Cato Institute website, I pulled it up on my phone. It says, promoting an American policy based on individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peaceful international relations. It's well known to be a libertarian public policy think tank. Okay, and you can tell, right? It doesn't mean that, there certainly may not be, but those points like individual liberty, limited government, free markets, that usually will skew more towards, if not conservative, a libertarian. Libertarian being a form of conservatism that's really about really small government. They don't want to see, government working, basically. I mean, not functioning. They want a functioning government, but they don't want to see it in our lives, right? They want a very small federal government. They want, state and local governments to do the work. And even then, they don't want a large overreach of government. So, knowing those things, right? That's the type of things you can start looking for when you read something like that. Looking for bias within an organization, how do they lean? Something like, Cato Institute. There's other, more liberal, more progressive. For some reason, it's slipping my mind. There's one that gets referenced a lot. You see they're the people on like news stations all the time, and it's just slipped my mind. But there's a lot of those. So D, this source is definitely biased towards federalism, and we could certainly look at the language within what's said here as well, right? The number of different A programs has soared from 463 in 1990 to 814. Soared, right? That's kind of a charged word, right? It just doesn't say has risen. That would be a little more impartial. Soared is implying sort of a negative connotation to how many federal aid programs are out there. Okay, so number 5. Etta, you want to read number 5 for us?
Okay, it says, which of the following best characterizes the tone of the article? A, dissatisfied, B, elusive, C, indifferent, or D, furious? A.
Yeah, it's dissatisfied, right, with the size of the federal government. They believe there's too much federal government, too much oversight, too many grants, too much federal money being spent, just too much. We're the Cato Institute, we're libertarian. That's the overall idea there. And I mean, I don't want to say that they don't have a point to make, and that's something that's worth taking a look at. But knowing how they feel about something, always, like I've told you before, if you can look at the author and get some insight into their background, that helps you understand, that entire writing, whatever you're looking at. And same thing with organizations. And perfect point, right? We heard that a lot of organizations aren't biased because they're nonprofits, but here's a clear indication of where they're going to be biased, right? If it's a type of public policy institute, they can be nonprofit, right? they could be all about nonprofit and they get that .org, but they can certainly have things on their website that's biased. So, all right, we've got 4 left here. Let's see. Sasha Gay, can you read number 6 for us? This my endorsements, checks and balances.
Okay. From my endorsements, checks and balances by Mike Henry, adjunct professor of history, Prince George's Community College for WashingtonPost.com, October 23rd, 2010. I endorse Robert Ulrich for government of Maryland. I am a registered Democrat, and I do not support all of Mr. Ulrich's positions, but I back him because I am a disciple of James Madison and believe in checks and balances. Our founding fathers were right. The people are safer and more secure in their liberty when power is divided. Both houses of Maryland's General Assembly are firmly in Democratic hands, and with the governorship, the party is in complete control. The single version concerning taxes, services, and social problems is unhealthy, as decisions are often made without serious debate or input from those with another point of view. We have witnessed the dangers of one-party control. We have witnessed the dangers of one-party control of the national level, as both Republicans, 2002 to 2006, and Democrats, 2009 to 2010, ran roughshod over the opposition and failed to seek bipartisan cooperation. The situation is clearly not good for the people of Maryland. From WashingtonPost.com, assessed 2013.
We'll go ahead and read the question for us too.
In which of the following ways does the author of the editorial support his opinion? A, he described the reliability of his argument. B, he gives details about Mr. Ulrich's positions. C, he refers to specific times when one party had too much control. D, he refers to opinions similar to his own. Is it A?
It's C. He refers to some of the specific times when one party had too much control. So yeah, like as both Republicans, 2002 and 2006, Democrats, 2009, 2010, ran roughshod over the competition, over the opposition, and failed to seek bipartisanship. Both houses of Maryland's General Assembly are firmly in Democratic hands. This single vision concerning taxes, services, and social problems is unhealthy, as decisions are often made without serious debate or input from those with another point of view. So he's referencing certain ideas there. And yeah, so this is this is opinion, of course, right? It would appear like an editorial page or opinion page of the Washington Post website. Again, so WashingtonPost.com. Washington Post is a newspaper. It's under journalism, but you got to consider too, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all those commercial, right? So they are also there to make money, even in their journalism. So C for number 6. And I'll finish off here. I think we just got one more. Yeah, so for the last 3 questions, I'll go ahead and read this section here. And it's from the Center for Legislative Archives. a part of the National Archives and Records Administration. So the federal government's archiving and records organization, and they have a huge task. So it says Martha Griffiths, Democrat from Michigan, was a member of the United States House of Representatives from 1955 to 1974. She was the first woman to serve on the powerful House Committee on Ways and Means and was instrumental in getting the prohibition of sex discrimination added to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. Griffiths is also known for resurrecting the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA was a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that guaranteed equal rights under the law for Americans, regardless of their sex. The ERA was first drafted in 1923 by suffragist Alice Paul, following the enactment of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. Paul believed the ERA to be the next step in guaranteeing equal justice to all citizens. From 1923 to 1970, some form of the ERA was introduced in every session of Congress, but nearly every time that the ERA was introduced, it was held up in committee. In 1970, Griffiths filed a discharge petition to demand that the ERA be heard by the full House. A discharge petition, which requires the signature of a majority of House members, forces proposed legislation out of committee so that it may be considered by the whole House of Representatives. Following the success of Griffith's discharge petition, the ERA was passed by the House. However, the Senate attempted to add provisions exempting women from the draft, which effectively killed the chances of the ERA passing that session. After some changes to the wording of the amendment, Griffiths reintroduced the ERA in the 92nd Congress as HJ, not sure what that is, RES 208. After months of debate, hearings, and House Judiciary Committee, that's House Judiciary Resolution 208, I bet that's what that is. Judiciary Committee proposed changes. The ERA, as introduced by Griffiths, was approved by the House on October 12, 1971. The Senate approved an identical version on March 22, 1972, sending the ERA to the states with a 7-year deadline for ratification. In 1978, with a 7-year deadline fast approaching, and the ERA lacking the required number of state ratifications, Congress extended the time limit to June 30th, 1982. However, by the time the extended deadline arrived, the ERA had only been ratified by 35 states, 3 states short of the 3/4 required for ratification of constitutional amendments. Controversy surrounding the Equal Rights Amendment persists today. Despite failing to garner enough support from the states by the deadline, some proponents argue that the existing 35 ratifications are still valid and that only an additional 3 state ratifications are needed to pass the ERA. As recently as 2005, resolutions attempting to revive the ERA have been introduced to Congress, but none of these resolutions have made it to a floor vote in either the House or Senate. And that is from archives.gov, Access 2013. Of course, that's the official site of the National Archives and Records Administration. All right, Tracy, would you like to read question 7 for us?
Okay, on my foot.
Did you say Grace?
I said Tracy.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
JC?
Yeah.
Yeah. Within the following best describe this information sources. A, unreliable. B, balanced. C, incorrect. D, impassioned. B.
B, it's fairly balanced, right? There's not a lot of biased language in there. It doesn't use a lot of adjectives or adverbs that are going to skew things. It's a fairly impartial, balanced representation of the facts. So that's pretty reliable there. So B, balanced. Okay, so number 8, Christiana, could you read number 8 for us?
Okay. It says which of the following interpretation may be considered biased against the Equal Rights Amendment? A. The Equal Rights Amendment would guarantee equal justice to all citizens regardless of sex. B. The Equal Rights Amendment was a result of the suffrage movement. Okay. C. The Equal Rights Amendment should not have been heard by the whole House of Representatives. D. The Equal Rights Amendment need to be verified by 3 more states. Is it D?
So it's C. So here, you know, we that's the only thing that's not basically a fact. So in the first one, we have the Equal Rights Amendment would guarantee justice to all citizens regardless of sex. That's, you know, the Equal Rights Amendment, that's, you know, language in there. And B, the Equal Rights Amendment was a result of the suffragist movement. So that's also a fact, right? That it came out of from where it says here, Alice Paul was one of the suffragists that helped get the women's vote. She drafted the first ERA legislation. So that's a fact. And then finally, the Equal Rights Amendment needed to be ratified by 3 more states. That's just a fact as well. The only thing here that's more opinion is the fact that it should not have been heard by the whole House of Representatives. That indicates bias, right? So C for cat. All right. And then finally, let's go with Grace for our final question here. Number 9.
Okay. Which of the following can be determined using this information source? A. The representative who introduced the Equal Rights Amendment to Congress. B. The fraction of states that must ratify an amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. C. The number of senators that approved the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972, sending it to the states to be ratified. And D. The House members that voted in favor of forcing the Equal Rights Amendment out of committee. Is it A?
It is B, right? How many states you must have to ratify an amendment. So that's, yeah, what you determine from the information source. Of course, there's a lot of else in there above and beyond that, but that's one of the facts that is presented there that's reliable. So B is in boy for number 9. All right. Anybody need me to follow up with any of the answers there for the workbook? Does everybody have all of the answers?